By the time the Varkeshi envoy laughed on the council floor, the casualty count from Halcyon Station had already passed 12,000, and the dead were still freezing in vacuum, with council protection seals stamped across their shattered hulls. The chamber lights glowed a calm, ceremonial blue. Translators whispered in 74 languages. Above the central dais, the live tactical feed showed a neutral refugee spindle split open from end to end, its rotation gone, its atmosphere venting in a white plume crowded with bodies, luggage, med crates, and the silver ribbons of emergency shelter film. The station had been under interstellar protection. The corridors had been packed with families from 6 species. Human relief crews had transmitted their registry twice. The Empire had fired anyway. And when Ambassador Elias Ward of Earth demanded immediate enforcement under Article 9 of the Concordant Charter, High Envoy Selkar of Varkesh adjusted his robes, looked directly at the cameras, and said, with a smile too small for what it carried, "If Terrans had spent half as much effort on strength as they do on patience, perhaps their dead would still be breathing." No one in the chamber gasped. That was the part Ward remembered later. Not the insult, not even the blood cooling in his veins. It was the silence. Counselors looked away, or down, or toward aides pretending to be busy with tablets full of casualty figures no one intended to honor. There were murmurs about procedure, about fact-finding, about proportional response, about avoiding escalation. Halcyon Station still turned outside the viewport like a broken prayer wheel, and the galaxy's highest body reached for paperwork. For 11 standard years, humanity had done everything the Council said civilized powers were supposed to do. When border colonies vanished under Varkeshi raids, humans filed formal protests. When merchant crews were taken in customs seizures and returned without their cargo and without some of their people, humans presented sensor logs, witness statements, and chain of custody verification. When a Terran school ship was forced out of superluminal transit and boarded in neutral space, Earth asked for arbitration. When pirate fleets operating from Imperial ports attacked food convoys to the Perseus settlements, the Terran Union escorted survivors home, rebuilt what had been burned, and requested sanctions through legal channels. They did not retaliate. They did not raid back. They did not threaten worlds or posture at borders. They waited, negotiated, and documented. They treated law as though law mattered. The galaxy mistook that for softness, because arrogance always calls discipline by the wrong name. The mockery had spread slowly, then all at once. Human patience became a phrase on diplomatic comedy streams, then a slur among military castes. Terrans were the species that apologizes while bleeding. Merchant captains joked that if you robbed a human freighter, they would send you a notarized complaint and a replacement parts invoice. Even some council members began using the word patience, the way one might say cowardice, without the burden of sounding crude. It did not help that humans were infuriatingly calm. Their admirals spoke in measured tones. Their parliament never pounded desks. Their border marines pulled civilians out of burning habitats before returning fire. Their diplomats carried records instead of threats. They made restraint look easy, and that offended a galaxy built on displays. But patience was not easy. It had a cost, and Halcyon was not the first payment. Before the station came the farming moon at Ananke, where irrigation domes were punctured by Varkeshi warning strikes, and 30,000 people suffocated among rows of half-grown grain. Before that came the Black Channel incident, where a human hospital frigate was boarded under truce beacon and its surgeons were lined against their own trauma ward glass. Before that came the silent camps on Chryse, where recovered prisoners described collars, labor pits, and the little metal stamps the Empire used to classify non-Varkeshi children by market value. Each time, the Terran delegation brought evidence. Each time, the Council delayed. Each time, Varkesh demanded context, invoked historic claim zones, and accused humans of emotional theater. Each time, more of the frontier learned what the word patience could taste like in the mouth of the dying. Halcyon crossed the line because it had not only been a human station, it had been a sanctuary, built by Terran engineers and supplied by Earth, yes, but inside were Kepri hatchlings from a world stripped by famine, Lauren families displaced by solar storms, traders from the Pelagic League, Sarah monks, council couriers, and 24 Varkeshi dissidents who had fled the Empire itself. The attack was not just murder. It was a declaration that no seal, no law, no chamber full of robes and titles meant anything if the Empire chose otherwise. The Varkeshi fleet commander had even broadcast his warning before the strike, a message later played across every human world until school children could recite it by heart. Neutrality does not shelter prey. Then the spinal cannon fired, and Halcyon came apart in the dark. Ambassador Ward stood through the laughter. He looked older than he had an hour before. The thin scar along his jaw, a relic from some forgotten accident before politics, seemed to sharpen under the chamber lights. When the presiding moderator asked whether the Terran delegation wished to submit additional evidence for the Sanctions Committee, several counselors smiled in tired sympathy, as if offering him one more dignified way to lose. Ward did not raise his voice. He did not strike the podium. He simply said, "The Terran Union formally records that the Council has been notified, petitioned, and given full evidentiary basis to act. We have complied with every procedural burden demanded of us. We have buried our citizens under your timelines. We have watched you rename slaughter as complexity. There will be no further petitions." The chamber stirred then, uneasy, because something in his tone had changed. Not anger, not exactly. Finality. Selkar spread his hands in theatrical pity. "At last," he said, "the humans run out of patience." Ward met his eyes. "No," he replied. "You have run out of ours." He turned and left with the entire Terran delegation in perfect silence. That silence moved faster than any speech. By the time the chamber doors sealed, messages were already pinging across diplomatic channels. Commentators declared the human withdrawal symbolic, an emotional gesture for domestic audiences. Council markets wobbled, then stabilized. Varkesh media celebrated a strategic victory. Some even speculated Earth would abandon the frontier entirely now that its bluff had been called. Hours passed. Then human embassies across Council space closed simultaneously. Terran merchant shipping altered course by pre-filed contingency routes. Civilian advisory nets on mixed-species stations flashed the same polite notice. Non-essential services suspended pending regional instability. Human maintenance crews left Council dry docks. Human medical contractors withdrew from luxury orbital clinics on the core worlds. The consequences did not feel like war at first. They felt like inconvenience. Then the lights started failing. Not everywhere, not dramatically, but piece by piece, across the worlds that had laughed loudest, systems began to slow. Half the Council's long-range comm relays had been built to Terran standards and depended on software keys renewed through Earthside lattice hubs. They did not shut down. They degraded into lag and packet loss, which, for interstellar governance, was sometimes worse. Hospital nanoforges on 3 wealthy stations discovered their sterile substrate shipments had come from Terran biolabs all along. Fleet depots reported that the ceramic shielding on their torpedoes, the calibration suites in their targeting arrays, the coolant valves inside their fusion spines, all relied on subcontractors tucked deep inside human industry. Cargo predictions collapsed. Insurance rates exploded. Entire sectors remembered, too late, that while humans had not dominated the galaxy with guns, they had threaded themselves through its arteries with patient competence until everyone else was breathing on Terran timing. Varkesh mistook this for a tantrum and launched its grand offensive on the frontier 48 hours later. 7 Imperial battle groups crossed into the Perseus March, expecting broken colonies and a panicked retreat. Instead, they found empty worlds. Not abandoned in chaos, evacuated. Power grids shut down in careful sequence, data cores wiped, agricultural vaults removed. Even the graveyards had been catalogued and their memorial stones taken for later reassembly. The few messages waiting in the settlement nets were all the same. Civilian populations relocated under continuity protocol.
No surrenders would be accepted, because no garrisons remained to surrender.
The Empire advanced anyway, planting flags over silent domes and dust. Then the first supply convoy vanished. Then the second. Then the beacons behind them began reporting impossible gravitic wakes in supposedly dead space. The human doctrine did not have a dramatic name in public. No one in the Council had paid attention when it appeared years earlier in an obscure strategic journal from the Terran Naval Academy. In military circles, it was called Deferred Force Integration. In plain language, it meant this: if conflict becomes unavoidable, do not answer when the enemy is ready. Answer when every dependency, every corridor, every evacuation route, every legal predicate, every rescue ship, and every ammunition train is already in your hands. Humans had not spent 11 years doing nothing. They had spent 11 years removing chance from the equation. They had hardened shipyards inside lunar shadows and Oort debris fields. They had turned civilian freight standards into modular war production without changing the external frames. They had drilled colonial evacuations so often that other species mocked them as paranoid disaster theater. They had mapped the Empire's logistics down to refinery cycles and food vault capacity. Most of all, they had waited until every human child within range of Varkeshi steel was behind layers of distance and defense. Patience, the galaxy learned too late, had been preparation wearing a polite face. The first warships appeared over Arcturus Gate, and the sensor operators who saw them thought their instruments were broken. The gate's outer traffic lane was packed with ordinary Terran bulk haulers an hour earlier, slow rectangular masses crawling under customs transponders. Now, those same silhouettes unfolded. Armor pedals rotated into lock, cargo spines separated into missile forests. Docking collars retracted to expose spinal rail assemblies the length of city blocks. Tugboats became escorts. Ice barges shed thermal skins and woke banks of hidden drives. A refinery tender split along its dorsal seam and birthed drones by the thousand. Behind them, rising out of cold nothing, came the ships no one had known existed at all. Black wedge destroyers with heat signatures like knife cuts. Carrier hulks built for endurance instead of spectacle. Siege platforms riding magnetic rings, fleet tenders the size of burrows. Hospital leviathans armored as heavily as battleships. They did not arrive in a roar of triumphant music. They arrived in formation. By the end of the first day, similar apparitions were reported in 29 systems. By the end of the second, in 93. Core analysts screamed that such a fleet could not possibly have been built in secret. But it had not been built in secret. It had been built in plain sight, by a civilization everyone had trained itself not to fear. In ports, in mines, in agricultural foundries, in civilian resiliency programs, in orbital habitats licensed as commercial expansion. Humanity had weaponized boring paperwork, shipping manifests, infrastructure tenders, and redundancy planning. The Terran fleet had not appeared from nowhere. It had appeared from everywhere. Then, Earth transmitted. There was no anthem, no flag animation, no roaring declaration of vengeance. Just Admiral Imani Vale in the command gallery of the flagship Resolute. Gray uniform immaculate, voice steady enough to shame a machine. She addressed the Council, the Empire, and every open channel in the march. Under charter failure, repeated non-enforcement of protected space provisions, documented mass atrocity, and imminent threat to sapient civilian populations, the Terran Union initiates unilateral, substituted enforcement. Human forces will dismantle Varkeshi offensive capacity, interdict all slaving traffic, secure refugee routes, and compel surrender of responsible command elements. Species not actively participating in imperial aggression will not be targeted. Protected populations, regardless of origin, may hail Terran rescue bands for extraction. Any attack on evac shipping will be met with total fleet response.
She paused, and for the first time there was a hint of something beneath the calm. Not rage, something colder. This is not retaliation. This is correction. Varkesh answered with contempt, because empires die hardest when they still believe their own stories. Grand Marshal Reth issued a challenge at Karth Gate, assembling the largest concentration of imperial tonnage seen in 3 generations. Hundreds of ships, carrier spears, plasma lances, shock squadrons bred on 100 victory myths. Council observers gathered to witness the Terrans finally break against proper power. What they saw instead entered military academies as the Karth demonstration, and was thereafter taught with a kind of horrified reverence. The human line did not rush forward. It thinned. It gave ground. It yielded approach vectors with mathematical neatness. The Imperial fleet, sensing weakness, accelerated into the lane network between the gate and the gas giant beyond. Then the mines woke. Not explosive mines, mass anchors, gravity webs seeded years in advance inside debris fields classified as commercial hazard mitigation. Imperial formations buckled as local space warped just enough to ruin firing solutions and throw fast movers out of sync. Human destroyers emerged from the shadows of their own silent drones and struck at engine clusters, comm masts, and magazine sections with surgical beams. Missile swarms never targeted bridges first. They targeted fuel, heat exchange, and maneuver. Ship after ship was not vaporized, but crippled, spun, blinded, isolated. The Varkeshi fought like predators. Humans fought like weather. When the Grand Marshal tried to rally his center by ordering an advance through the distortion field, Admiral Vale transmitted a single line to all channels. "You are still mistaking restraint for inability." Then the Resolute fired its spinal accelerator for the first time.
The shot crossed 7,000 kilometers, punched through 3 aligned dreadnoughts, and struck the gate support frame behind them so hard the whole structure rang like a bell through subspace. The sound was picked up on civilian receivers across the sector as a deep metallic groan that made children cover their ears and old soldiers go pale. Karth fell in 22 minutes. The Imperial survivors surrendered in clotted pockets, stunned less by defeat than by the realization that humanity could have done this years earlier and had chosen not to. News of Karth did not end the war. It accelerated it. Panicked Imperial governors began purging dissidents and torching archive vaults. Slaver guilds fled toward deep ports. The Council fractured into 3 camps: those who demanded censure of Earth for unauthorized military action, those who quietly rerouted embassies under Terran protection, and those who finally began reading the evidence they had ignored for a decade. More revelations followed, because humans had prepared those too. Encrypted Imperial orders were released to the public. Payment trails linking Council officials to Varkeshi influence brokers flooded the nets. Coordinates of prison worlds appeared beside live rescue requests. But the most devastating human choice was not exposure. It was mercy. Terran fleets did not glass cities. They did not poison atmospheres or crater worlds from orbit, though by then everyone knew they could. They punched corridors through Imperial defenses, seized ports, cut power to military installations, and opened the cages. On Varos, human marines fought deck by deck through a labor moon and emerged carrying children who had been born in chains and did not know what open sky was. On Kepri's Fall, a Terran hospital ship took aboard 12,000 enemy civilians after their own governor sabotaged life support to cover his escape. On Nemea Station, the same species who had mocked human patience watched Terran engineers seal breached sectors by hand while under fire, because there were still non-combatants inside. The message spread faster than the fleet. Humans had come to war with all the violence the galaxy feared and all the discipline it had never understood. That was what broke the old certainty. Not just that Earth was strong, that Earth was strong enough to choose. Varkesh made one final gamble. Unable to stop the Terran advance at the frontier, the Empire struck at legitimacy instead. A covert battle group slipped through old diplomatic lanes toward the Council capital, planning to seize the Grand Convocation during emergency session and force a settlement with the chamber itself as hostage. It should have worked. The Council's own defense grid was under strength, its response times ruined by the very complacency humans had warned against for years. Panic spread through the orbital ring as unidentified drives lit on the outer plane. The same counselors who had debated procedure over Halcyon now shouted over one another for shelter access and military escorts that did not exist. Then every viewport darkened. At first, the capital thought power had failed. Then the stars returned, sliced by moving silhouettes so vast they eclipsed whole constellations. Terran warships. Not one or two, a wall of them. Their hulls carried the dull, scarred finish of vessels built to survive ugly work. Running lights burned in measured bands. Escort screens spread like schools of iron fish. The flagship Resolute took position between the incoming Imperial strike group and the Council ring with such perfect confidence that older diplomats later said it looked less like an interception than a judgment already delivered. Human fighters spilled outward in disciplined spirals. Point defense grids laced the void. A fleet that could have conquered the capital in an hour instead formed a shield around the people who had abandoned it. The battle outside the council ring lasted 9 minutes. It was not close. One Varkeshi cruiser tried to bluff a collision course toward the chamber's spindle and was cut into spinning sections before it reached weapons range. Another attempted a surrender feint and opened missile bays under truce light. Human fire erased its drives and left it tumbling intact for boarding. The rest broke, scattered, and died in pieces. Inside the chamber, alarms still screamed while counselors stared through the glass at the impossible truth they had spent years refusing to imagine. The humans had come. Not because the council deserved saving, because the law did. When the all-clear sounded, Ambassador Ward returned to the same podium he had left days before. The chamber was packed. Some counselors could not meet his eyes. Others looked at him the way prey looks at a cliff edge, trying to calculate whether there is any route backward. He did not humiliate them. That would have been easier. Instead, he laid Halcyon's casualty ledger on the central stand, page by page, until the stack rose like a white pillar between them.
"You thought patience meant we feared war," he said. "We feared becoming casual about it. We feared answering atrocity with appetite. We feared the day our children would learn to enjoy what they were good at. So we waited. We petitioned. We documented. We gave law every chance to be law. The Empire interpreted that mercy as weakness. Many of you helped them do it." He let the words settle. No one moved. "Let the record show that humanity did not go to war when insulted. Not when robbed. Not when slandered. Not even when attacked. Humanity went to war when it became undeniable that your inaction had turned patience into permission. By the time Varkesh surrendered, its fleets were broken, its prison worlds opened, its slaving houses reduced to evidence lockers and ash. The terms were harsh, surgical, and inescapable. Responsible officials were delivered for trial. Border systems were demilitarized under multinational oversight, led, to the Council's enduring discomfort, by Terran command. Reparations were directed first not to Earth, but to the worlds the Empire had fed on. The war had lasted only 73 days. The political consequences lasted generations. Militaries rewrote doctrine. Diplomatic academies added entire courses on Terran escalation thresholds. Industrial consortiums quietly audited how dependent they were on human infrastructure and discovered, with fresh unease, that the answer remained deeply. Across the galaxy, the old jokes vanished. No one used the phrase human patience with a smile anymore. On restored Halcyon, rebuilt around the original broken spine and left deliberately scarred as memorial architecture, delegations from 100 species came to witness the relighting of the sanctuary beacons. Terran engineers worked beside Kepri masons, pelagic welders, Sera archivists, even former Varkeshi citizens who had chosen exile over empire. The names of the dead were etched into alloy bands that caught the station's rotation light and sent it washing through the corridors like moving dawn. At the ceremony, no human gave a triumphal speech. There was no boasting. Only a brief message from Admiral Vale, transmitted from the fleet anchorage before the Terran armada turned homeward. "Let no one say again that we were slow to anger. We were slow to certainty. There is a difference." Long after the fleet departed, after the salvage fires cooled, and the trials began, and the children rescued from prison moons learned to sleep without listening for boots in the corridor, the galaxy kept asking the same question in different forms. Why had humanity waited so long? if this was what it could do.
The answer unsettled everyone because it was simple. Humans had not been delaying war because they were incapable of it. They had been delaying it because once they began, they intended to finish it without losing themselves. And that took preparation, measured not only in weapons, but in conscience. The Council had mocked that patience as though it were emptiness. It had never been empty. It had been a locked door with something immense standing quietly behind it. Human patience was never weakness. It was the last warning.